The following is a production of KYNE TV in cooperation with UNO Television. Consider This with Carol Schrader, a news and informational program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome to the Milo Bale Student Center at UNO. I have a really great plate today with some wonderful guests. With me today is Ed Mims. He's Public Information Director of the Nebraska Equal Opportunity Commission. LaVon Stennis is an attorney in Omaha. She is owner and founder of Stennis & Associates, also former chairperson of the EEOC in Nebraska. Also with us today is John Herz. He's new to Omaha, District Director of the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. Now you probably say, what do these people have in common? Well, what they're going to talk about in common today is the issue of affirmative action. We have just passed Martin Luther King holiday. I think that we're in the afterglow of celebrating the diversity of the people in our community and our nation. But that pesky issue of affirmative action to some people is one of the things that I think prevents people from really taking part in the enjoyment and the relishing of our diversity. And I think one of the things, and we were talking here, I even may be under a misconception as to what those two words mean. To many people it means minorities are guaranteed a job and whites aren't, or women are guaranteed a job and men aren't. Who wants to take a stab at it? What does affirmative action mean legally in our country today?
I personally feel that there is no legal definition of affirmative action. And I think that is one of the problems that we have with affirmative action. It has never been clearly defined as what affirmative action really is and what it is not. And therefore it's left up to politicians and lawmakers and various people who want to skew a person's opinion of affirmative action when they go to define it. I think affirmative action in and of itself, the name does not tell you what it is supposed to do, but I think it's accepted by many people as being that tool whereby inferior minorities are given jobs over qualified majority, and that is the wrong definition of affirmative action.
Another word that comes to mind when we hear affirmative action is quotas. And quotas, as I understand it, exist in very few places.
Right. Our agency enforces equal opportunity and affirmative action regulations with contractors, private contractors holding federal contracts. We have a definition of affirmative action in that it's one part of affirmative action is to ensure that equal opportunity exists. Okay, and the second prong of affirmative action is a recruitment and outreach that contractors would do. Now, nowhere in those regulations or in any time we audit a company would we ever look at an unqualified person filling a position, regardless of their race and sex and national origin. So for us, it's pretty straightforward, pretty clear. The contractor has to ensure that they do not have any discriminatory pockets within their company, and second is that they do the outreach. Absent that, for instance, if you take a typical hiring situation, the contractor, if it met certain thresholds, would have to develop a written affirmative action plan. And that's how it evaluates its employment actions. Now, again, if there was a hiring that would take place, the contractor would have a written affirmative action plan in place, and then they would have already marked out the path they are going to take when a hiring opportunity occurs, and the outreach that they would try to get a diversified pool of qualified candidates. Once that occurs, absent any employment discrimination, the contractor's workforce will eventually mirror what's out in the public. And that's what our job is to do, is to see that occurs. And to answer your question, no. In no time do we have, only in certain rare times would we ever talk about anything other than qualified people being placed.
In the state of Nebraska, where would be some of the areas where affirmative action would be felt the most? Obviously, contracts with the federal government here in Nebraska. Where would be some of the other places? In other words, if I were going to go look for a job, where would be some of the kinds of places? Big corporations that do business with the federal government? Any corporation that does business with the federal government?
I think in theory, the hope is that all businesses that employ anyone, regardless of the size, will practice affirmative action. But once again, the problem is that affirmative action is not clearly defined. The rules, there are no rules that require affirmative action is a voluntary program that you have to act on the good faith of an employer to utilize. There is no check and balance of that good faith effort is going to be exercised in a positive manner. If you were to be looking for a job, there really is no place that you can go and say that I know this person is actually practicing affirmative action. We can hope that they are. And a fallacy with this is oftentimes the government is one of the key promoters of affirmative action. But oftentimes you go into the offices, and the offices that are supposed to be promoting affirmative action have no minorities working there. If you look at city and county government, you know, there are offices that have never had a minority working there, but yet you have a policy that's enforced by this government that says in order to do business with men, you must practice affirmative action.
Okay, so I'm confused, okay? So if affirmative action is to make it possible for women and minorities to move into positions that are traditionally not held by women and minorities, then how could you go into city government, say for instance, or Douglas County government, and have positions that are never held by a woman or a minority, other minority?
Yeah, let me attack that for you. You know, interesting enough, we have to go back to the inauguration parade of President John Kennedy, and we know how the parade goes down the avenue. He was sitting there observing the fact that of all of these people that was coming by, there was few, if any, minorities. And he commented while sitting there that, don't we have blacks in the military? And the answer was, yes, Mr. President, but this is the elite. And from that comment, as you may recall, or those of us old enough, when he died, carrying his casket then was what we call diversity. Following that, then President Johnson, who ascended to the presidency, issued an executive order called 11246. It's so commonly known to all of us, kind of quoted sometime. But it was designed to reach out and make sure that, first of all, there was quote unquote equal opportunity. Remember now, this was at a time when we was moving from the days of Jim Crow law and segregation to civil rights, if you will. Mm-hmm. Civil rights bill was coming into play.
That was the civil rights era.
Right. So after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was finally passed, then we began to look around and see that there was still a lack of blacks in jobs. Females not even considered at this time, just blacks in jobs, which was very obvious to see because color was always so obvious when you look at it. Well, the executive order was designed to say that you will, in fact, make this a diverse working force. And by that, that's where this term of quotas came into play. What it said in essence was that if you have none, you must get some. And the only way you're going to get some, you have to stop taking others till you get some in. Now, whatever that number is, we're not going to tell you to get 10, 15, or 20, but when you look around the area from which you drew your employees, you cannot tell me you can't find, quote unquote, some black people, and then they started using a bit about whether they're not qualified. Well, that's not true. And the case that we always quote is one called Griggs case that happened down in North Carolina, where they had blacks who was at the very lowest level of jobs, wanting to ascend just to the next level, and they put in a requirement that said, but you have to have a high school education. What they discovered was that the whites who had previously done that job did not have a high school education, so the court said, then obviously you don't need a high school education to do this job. And we sort of used that then as the benchmark of the cases that we would quote from the Supreme Court as what you needed to do to get to what we call equal opportunity. And that's really what it's all about. Affirmative action is nothing more than a mechanism that you put in place to ensure equal opportunity. It can be mandatory or it can be voluntary. If you fail to do it on a voluntary basis, yes, if your history shows that you discriminated, the courts will mandate that you establish, quote unquote, an affirmative action program. And that's, again, where this so-called quota bid come in. They will tell you that you will hire 1 for 2 or 2 for 1, whatever remedy they come up with. That's how it would be. And that's how we was able to get then to places like police department, bringing on females, fire departments, bringing on females, and changing the name. Remember we talked about
Firemen, firefighter,
fireman,
policeman,
yeah,
police officer.
policeman. Now it's police officer and a firefighter. And of course, as you said, it was the Old Boys Network. And when you look at the corporate structure right now, males are there. And the reason affirmative action has reached back and started all over again and is being debated as it is and misunderstood so much, because now it's an economic thing. As long as those on top was remaining on top, everybody could go up, as I indicated in the Griggs case. But now that they're doing downsizing from an economic standpoint, people are toppling with these so-called PhDs and master's degrees. Now they're trying to reach back and say, well, I'm better qualified. But are you better qualified with a PhD to run that camera than a person who's a student at this school who has no degree? The answer is no. It's simply experience. So they're coming up with the bit about, well, I'm better qualified because I hold these quote-unquote degrees. Has no meaning at all. It's still equal opportunity, and diversity is what we're looking at, and obviously color is what stands out the most.
What about the issue of quotas? They really are in limited cases. You mentioned
Absolutely,
court
courts
mandates.
will impose quotas, yeah.
They're not all over the board, are they?
No.
I mean, in fact, many of them have outlived being set. I mean, I believe that
Well, it was never really a quota, Karen. It was what we call goals and timetables. And I use that all the time. You take, for instance, a kid who is 10 years old who wants a driver's license. They have a goal and a timetable, a goal and objective. They can't get it till they reach that age, so they have to go through that stage. When they reach the age, then you can get it. So what they was calling quotas was really a goal and a timetable. I intend to have this by this time, and that's all it was. But people were saying, well, it's a quota because it kept me out. It didn't keep you out. It let me in, and that's all it is. Again, it's equal opportunity.
Do you handle cases, Levon, of people concerned about, feel that they were disenfranchised from a job or position because of affirmative action, or people violating affirmative action?
Since leaving the commission, I have started taking cases where people felt that they were discriminated against. And I often caution my clients that there is a difference between affirmative action and equal opportunity laws, and that one is a voluntary program and one is actually the law. Title VII prohibits an employer from discriminating against age, sex, race, national origin. However, just because you did not get the job does not mean that a Title VII law has been violated. And it also does not mean that just because an employer says he is an affirmative action employer that he has to hire you when you come in off the street for employment. And I get just as many whites coming in as I do African Americans or other minorities who feel that they have been violated because they were not chosen as the successful applicant.
Do you think that this downsizing and this whole job insecurity is playing into people's fears and paranoia about what kept me from getting that job?
When I was a commissioner, I saw an increase in the number of complaints being filed by white males as companies were downsizing and reducing their workforce. Many felt that they were being targeted because they were over a certain age. Many of them at that age were at a certain economic income category with the employer. The employer would say we were trying to reduce our bottom line and therefore we went after certain income levels. Well, there was a relationship between the age and the income level. Of course, the other issue I see here is that whole white male, angry white male syndrome that has been surfacing recently, starting with the Newt Gingrich era, where many of them felt they had been disenfranchised as white males in favor of women and minorities. So you start seeing affirmative action laws, Title VII laws being questioned, being tested to their ultimate limit.
With regard to contract compliance on the federal government, I've read statistics that said that as many as 3/4 of the companies would have diversity programs and affirmative action programs even if the law did not exist. How far are we maybe from reaching the point where we don't have to have as much oversight, or will we always need to do that, or at least in our future?
Well, I think any time you're talking about federal money or U.S. dollars being given to contractors to fulfill a purpose for the federal government, I think everyone has a vested interest in that those tax dollars are being given to companies that use best practices. You know, I don't know how to really answer that question, because on one hand you could say, but you know, we still litigate discrimination cases. We still have contractors that do not put forth a good faith effort to try to recruit qualified minorities and females and Vietnam era veterans and the disabled. So, you know, you could always have two sectors saying that without a government agency to enforce these regulations, you're going to have slackers, companies that won't want to comply or don't have to, or feel they don't have to comply. So, you know, we would hope that eventually all of us could work ourselves out of a job. But I think from a realistic standpoint, you know, until I think universally contractors see the benefit of a diverse workforce, you know, there's always going to have to be someone, you know, watching over and, you know, making sure that regulations are complied with.
There is in this town, in this state, a worker shortage. And I suppose you could go all the way back to the educational system and preparing young students, no matter what their race or sex or handicap or challenge, for the workforce. But it seems to me that it would be in everyone's best interest. A diversity program in a company would also double as just a good mechanism, a good vehicle to find the best employees.
But once again, I think that was the problem. Affirmative action was never promoted under that title of showing that by having a diverse workforce, you're also getting a benefit. Affirmative action was promoted as trying to right a wrong. And many people present day say, I did not participate in that wrong. Why am I being burdened by affirmative action? The government has to take the initiative in promoting affirmative action from the benefit of diversity in your workforce. And I think what you have nowadays is you have many companies who are able to slide by under, I have a diverse workforce, but the minorities do not make head of household wages. And I think affirmative action has to, if you're going to implement it, it has to be across the board. It does no good for minorities to have a system in place that says in order to do a contract with the government, you must be an affirmative action employer, when the type of people who are getting the job, the minorities that are getting the type of jobs, are entry-level, minimum wage type positions. It does not help the minority person.
Well, I would like to address that in just to give a little brief background of how we evaluate a contractor in their affirmative action efforts. It's first of all, we look at the contractor's workforce as you would like a departmental workforce. What's the makeup of the departments? Where is everyone within that department? Are we showing women at the lower ends of the departments? Just to look at what trends we can see by looking at the various departments. And then we dissect the workforce laterally or horizontally across what's called job groups. Jobs that have similar content, wage rates, and opportunities. So it's very much different than a workforce or department analysis, and we're looking and lumping those jobs that are similar wage rate, content, and opportunity together. From that point, we look at, from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, what is the makeup in the public for jobs similar to those. And we take the contractor's representation and compare it to the outside representation through a series of what's called an 8-factor analysis. There's 8 factors we take into consideration, and we see if particular job groups are fully utilized, underutilized, and so forth. That way, in answer to your question, a contractor, if they have an employment of 500 people and 300 of which are African American employees, yet at the bottom rung, the contractor cannot say, well, my workforce is diverse and therefore I'm fine, because we need to look at that workforce by putting people together. And then once we determine an underutilization within a particular job group, specific action-oriented programs are set forth for that job group so that when openings occur, it is already planned how you are going to fill those positions. If we're talking about high-level scientific positions, the contractor already has mapped out how they're going to try to get a diverse pool of qualified applicants for those positions.
Their recruitment efforts.
Right.
Well, but that seems to be a problem everywhere. Do you give them are you helpful, or are you kind of a nag, or I suppose it would depend on who you talk to, right?
I would think that they would view us as being helpful, because it is to develop a proper affirmative action plan, and which is really a diversity plan, a well thought out diversity plan. You know, there is quite a bit of learning curve. We have compliance officers that have been doing this job for a number of years, and you know, it takes a while to bring the contractors' skill sets up to what the requirements of the regulations are. And further, we then, in the contractors, required to do all these things itself. It's just that this is what we do when we do an audit of the contractor.
And if I was a white employer walking into the federal government who's mandating these things of me, if I were to go into the Zorinsky Federal Building right now and just say, take a tour of the 8th floor, the 9th floor, you will see federal judges who've never employed African Americans or other minorities. You would go down to the clerk's office, there's never been minorities work there, public defender's office. The prosecutor, I think, hired their first African American prosecutor last year. He left, they've replaced him with another one. These are the people who are actually enforcing our provisions, but yet they don't practice them themselves. And that is the whole fallacy in this whole argument or discussion over affirmative action. The people who are in charge of promoting it do not practice it themselves. And it's hard to make corporate America do that.
Well, I would like to address that, because first of all, and I don't know the numbers, and I would assume there are areas of the federal government that there's a lower representation of minorities or female. However, the federal government is much different in selecting employees than a private sector is. If I had my own company and I was a human resource person or the president of a private firm, I would be responsible for recruiting my own people. Now, it's different than, for instance, we have openings and have had openings in our department, but I have nothing to do with the recruiting. And in order to get a diverse representation, you know, you're going to have to get a diverse qualified applicant pool. If I'm not responsible for it, and we have our own personnel system that is quite different than if I would go out and recruit. I mean, they have opening and job announcements, and the federal government lists openings very statically in that there's a set procedure how to do it.
So there's a double standard a little bit?
Well, I don't think it's a double standard. It's sometimes you're not in control, and if you're talking about judges, they may only get sent to them the applicants that the personnel department, when they put an announcement and people came to apply for that met the minimum qualification.
But my point is if it's the government, regardless of who's responsible for recruiting and hiring or sending applicants, if it's the government who's pushing affirmative action, you would think that charity will begin at home, that one could go in any department and see a representation of minorities, women, you know, whether it's African Americans, Hispanics, whatever. But I think that is how they've allowed to escape there by saying, I don't hire, I don't recruit. I'm just the innocent. You're not the innocent person. When you represent federal government and federal government is promoting affirmative action and Title VII, then federal government should practice what they're preaching.
I would guess that a federal judge, now just hear me out, because I know they carry a great deal of clout, could say, turn a list back if it doesn't have,
Sure.
and say, I'll hire somebody temporary until you can find. I mean, they probably have more clout.
Or the U.S. Attorney's Office, they hired, I think Greg Rhodes was the first African American attorney that have ever been in that position. And he left, and they have now Mr. Franklin. And you cannot tell me that affirmative action is being practiced in that office, given the number of unemployed Black and other minority attorneys that are out here that are forced to go into their little private practice in order to get employment.
Yeah. You see, Carol, that term, that's why we say the term affirmative action is really a misnomer, and no one has ever given it a clear definition. But equal opportunity has always been what it's been all about. I mean, we talk about people being, he stated, minimally qualified. Well, if a person can't get into an educational institution, how are they going to acquire what's needed to be, quote unquote, minimally qualified for the standards that's being set by someone who's already calling the shots? And that's why school desegregation had to come about, because that was this thing about everybody's going to school, but then we were saying at the end, but you're not as qualified as the other person who graduated from the 12th grade because they went to a white school and you went to a black school.
Well, we could do a whole show on that, or
That's
two,
right.
or three,
Yeah.
or four.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just here, and affirmative action is a thing that people sometimes get mixed up on. But what I still hear today in 1998, you still hear the term, the first black this and the first black that. That should not be.
We should not be using the first for anything.
That's right. It should not be the first for anything.
And another example that I like to bring up is the fact that when you go into, even our U.S. senators, and the issue of quotas or goals or just one or whatever, we have one senator who has no African Americans working for him or no other minorities. Or if you go out there, there may be just one.
We only have about a minute and a half, and I'd like to just wrap this up. The future of affirmative action and or equal opportunity, if you wish. John, we'll start with you. What can we look for in the next decade?
Well, I think, again, that as long as people value diversity, there's always going to be some sort of outreach that is a prong of affirmative action. As long as people value the diversity, and companies realize that a diverse workforce is better than a non-diverse workforce, and as long as they have means to reach out and find the qualified people to get a good pool, I think it will continue. Now, you know, depending on, we operate under an executive order, and you know, depending on the presidency, that could be eliminated.
Well, we'll be on the lookout for that. That's always a possibility, is it not?
If it's not going to be properly enforced from the top down, it needs to be eliminated. And we need to quit giving this false sense of security out here in the employment arena.
False sense of security to whom?
That we have minorities, that there is this affirmative action theory out here that is going to protect us and promote our hiring. If it's not going to be enforced properly, it needs to be eliminated.
So it needs more work on being enforced.
Yes.
Well, yeah, I see affirmative action as being around pursuant to the executive order because it's something that we just throw out. But equal opportunity will always be there, and the laws to enforce it will always be there. So it takes an attitude adjustment is what it takes for everybody.
Well, it takes an adjustment to this show if we go any longer, and I'll be in trouble. Thank you very much. Ed Mims, LaVon Stennis, and John Hearns, thank you for joining us on Consider
Thank you
This.
for inviting.